That afternoon, the sun showed no mercy. Wave after wave of scorching heat hammered the barren landscape until it felt like the very ground was crying out in pain. Right there, sprawled across that desolate expanse of sand and stone, a young woman remained trapped, her hands bound tightly to metal stakes driven far into the hard earth. Her legs were tied so severely that the rope carved welts into her flesh. Laid out like an offering to the unforgiving sky, she struggled with every shallow breath. Her clothing hung in tatters, her mouth dried and split open, crimson seeping from the cracks. Strands of hair clung to her face, soaked through with perspiration. Each inhale brought agony. Each tiny shift brought torment around her. The townsfolk maintained their distance, frozen in collective silence, every gaze trained on her fragile form. Several couldn't bear to watch and turned aside, drowning in shame. Others stared with icy approval, as though witnessing her anguish somehow justified their own terror. Leading them all was Silas Boone, the settlement's leader, a figure whose piercing stare could rival any predator's, whose commanding tone demanded absolute obedience. Though his fingers rested against his whip's grip, he felt no need to actually use it. The binding ropes and relentless sunlight served as punishment all on their own, breaking through the heavy quiet. Boone's declaration rang out. "We honor the customs passed down through generations," he announced, gesturing toward the suffering girl. "Should she endure 3 full days beneath heaven's watch, she earns her freedom. Should death claim her, her wrongdoing stands confirmed. Such is our code." Nobody dared oppose him. The villagers gave slow nods of agreement, some murmuring prayers beneath their breath, others spitting onto the parched ground as though sealing some sacred pact. Her identity was Abigail Dawson, merely 23 summers old. Accusations of theft had been leveled against her by the very community now demanding retribution. Gold had disappeared from the settlement's supplies, and Boone had declared her the culprit. Despite her passionate denials and desperate pleas of innocence, her testimony held zero influence against his absolute power. So there she remained, helpless and restrained, her flesh scorching beneath that heartless sky. Her throat raw, she attempted one more plea. "I'm begging you all. I've done nothing wrong. Please." Yet the arid winds scattered her words like dust, and the crowd simply watched on. Mothers held their children close. Elderly men stood with folded arms. Not a single person moved forward. To them, this wasn't barbarism, it was their version of righteousness. It represented tradition. Multiple generations had followed these laws of flame and earth, and challenging them meant opposing the entire community itself, and so they pivoted away, abandoning her to whatever verdict the heavens would deliver. The sun continued its brutal ascent. The scorching ground beneath Abigail seared her exposed skin. Her eyelids drifted between open and shut as if consciousness itself had become unbearable. Time crawled forward. Her reality shrank down to nothing but her racing pulse and the persistent drone of insects hovering above the fractured soil. She could detect the metallic taste of blood coating her tongue. Her voice had deteriorated beyond proper cries, now just faint murmurs that the wasteland consumed without hesitation, yet even drowning in desperation. One persistent thought anchored itself in her fading consciousness. She refused to perish unwitnessed. She couldn't bear disappearing without anyone hearing what really happened. Abigail's lips quivered, and she sent up prayers that perhaps anyone might travel through this godforsaken territory and acknowledge her suffering, but who could possibly arrive? And if by chance someone did appear, would they possess the courage to challenge such deeply rooted customs? Would they dare confront Boone and his followers, or simply continue onward, consigning her to the sun's brutal verdict? What fate awaited her in this place where fairness had been corrupted into ceremony? The sun had begun its descent, though its punishing heat remained strong enough to blister exposed skin. Abigail's voice had deteriorated into barely audible whispers. She'd surrendered all hope of rescue. Then a sound emerged, hoofbeats crushing the dried earth below. Methodical, unwavering. Her eyes struggled open, and through waves of heat distortion she glimpsed him, a towering silhouette astride his horse, back straight, advancing with the deliberate caution of someone who'd navigated countless conflicts and survived to remember each one. Elias Carter, 56 years of age. A rancher these days, though formerly a military man who'd returned from combat carrying both physical wounds and haunting memories. He'd deliberately selected solitude instead of society, labor instead of leisure, an isolated ranch instead of bustling settlements. But that chosen silence shattered the instant he spotted her, a girl secured to 4 metal posts. Skin ravaged by restraints, lips destroyed by dehydration, she managed to raise her head just barely, whispering forth her plea, "Please, I'm begging you. Release me." Those words struck him with the force of ammunition penetrating his chest. He could have simply continued riding. That would have been the prudent decision. Everyone throughout these regions understood better than to interfere with Silas Boone and his peculiar interpretations of law. Yet Elias wasn't constructed to ignore another's suffering. Not following everything he'd witnessed. Not after losing his own family because others chose indifference, he dismounted, his boots meeting the fractured ground with a crunch. Kneeling beside Abigail, his shadow provided momentary relief across her burned flesh. Her eyes searched his face, filled simultaneously with dread and desperate optimism. "You're innocent, aren't you?" he murmured quietly. "Yes," she croaked, her voice nothing more than escaping breath. "I swear on everything sacred." "I am." Elias retrieved a blade from his belt and severed the bindings around her wrists. The cord snapped apart, revealing angry crimson marks across her skin. Her hands shook uncontrollably as though she couldn't process being unbound. Next, he sliced through the ankle restraints and hoisted her upward with remarkable power for someone his age. She felt weightless in his grasp. The desert had already drained too much from her being. He transported her toward his waiting horse. Behind them, concealed from view, a couple of villagers observed from the hilltop, their eyes expanding with astonishment. They'd rush back to inform Boone shortly. The rancher hadn't merely violated a rule, he'd openly defied their sacred customs. As Elias positioned Abigail onto the saddle, her damaged voice emerged again. "They'll execute you for what you've done." Elias cast a glance her direction. His expression hardened with determination. "Let them make the attempt," he responded. And with a pull of the reins, the horse lurched forward, transporting them away from that cursed plot of land. But neither understood what obstacles lay waiting just beyond the hillside. Would Boone and his enforcers permit their escape so effortlessly, or was this merely the opening chapter of something far more perilous? Elias had scarcely guided the horse past the ridge when a commanding voice pierced the air. "Halt immediately, Carter." The words sliced sharply through the arid breeze. He tugged the reins and rotated his head. There positioned himself Silas Boone, accompanied by 4 subordinates. Boone's lengthy coat billowed in the wind current, his palm hovering near his revolver's handle. Behind him, one associate gripped a substantial wooden club. Another brandished a blade catching the sunlight, while a third clutched a pistol partially withdrawn from its holster. Boone's stare locked onto Elias. "You believe you can simply ride away with her? You've just disrespected the code of this settlement, the principles our ancestors established." Elias responded in measured, composed, steady tones. "That code isn't fairness. Silas, it's brutality, and you're fully aware she's no criminal. You simply required a scapegoat." Boone's mouth twisted into a mirthless smirk. His associates fanned outward to obstruct the pathway. Abigail gripped the saddle's horn tightly, whispering fearfully, "They're going to kill you." Elias adjusted his stance, his hand grazing the grip of his aged colt, though keeping it holstered. The tension stretched unbearably. Then the initial attacker charged forward, swinging his wooden club. Elias sidestepped and delivered his fist straight into the man's midsection. The club tumbled groundward as the man doubled over in pain. The second rushed in swiftly with his knife. Elias intercepted his wrist, wrenched forcefully, and watched the blade sail into the dirt. A precise elbow strike to the jaw laid him out cold. The third elevated his pistol. Abigail inhaled sharply, but Elias reacted faster. He kicked the man's forearm. The weapon discharged wildly skyward, and Elias drove him down into the dust. The final associate froze solid, glancing toward Boone for instruction. Boone remained motionless. His jaw clenched tight, yet his hand lingered near his revolver without actually drawing. He recognized better than to escalate this confrontation. Elias had experienced genuine warfare, and Boone could detect that reality reflected in his eyes. The rancher wasn't posturing. Boone expelled saliva into the dirt. "This matter isn't concluded, Carter. You and that girl will answer for this, both of you." He pivoted sharply and signaled his associates to withdraw. The defeated men scrambled upright, limping backward with their dignity as shattered as their bodies. Silence descended once more. Elias breathed heavily yet steadily. He mounted the horse alongside Abigail, who regarded him with mingled terror and reverence. Neither spoke as they continued forward, though both recognized this represented merely the beginning. Boone had suffered humiliation, and individuals like him never forgave such insults. Now the question loomed ominously. Where could they possibly flee? And who, if anyone at all, would risk standing alongside them? If you've stayed with me until now, I appreciate you deeply. Hit that subscribe button to ensure you won't miss the continuation of this frontier saga. And while you're enjoying your beverage of choice, share with me, what hour is it in your location? And from where are you tuning in? The settlement remained hushed as Elias directed the horse into the sheriff's courtyard. Abigail wobbled in the saddle, barely conscious, and Elias steadied her before she could tumble. Sheriff Thomas Hale emerged from his headquarters, his palm resting on his belt as he observed their approach. "Elias Carter," he stated deliberately, "I haven't laid eyes on you since the conflict ended, and now you appear here with a girl on the verge of collapse. What on earth transpired?" Elias carried Abigail indoors and settled her onto a bench. Boone's identity left his mouth like a dropped stone. The sheriff's expression grew stern. "That individual has been parading around like royalty for far too long," Hale muttered under his breath. He crouched beside Abigail, examined the rope damage on her wrists, and shook his head disapprovingly. "She requires hydration, nourishment, and recuperation. However, I find her account credible. Still, credibility alone won't suffice. We'll need concrete evidence." He looked back toward Elias. "Grant me time. I'll investigate thoroughly. I'll dispatch men to interrogate the merchants. I'll examine Boone's financial records and his storage facilities. If corruption exists, we'll uncover it." Elias nodded in agreement. He had faith in this individual. They'd once fought side by side in battle, and though the passing years had transformed them both, that connection persisted. The subsequent days unfolded gradually yet carried tremendous weight. Abigail remained in a modest room adjacent to the sheriff's headquarters. Elias visited regularly, occasionally bringing her fresh bread or a metal cup filled with coffee. Initially, she communicated sparingly, her voice weakened by desert exposure. But gradually she started revealing more. She described her parents, the farmland she'd once cultivated, how everything crumbled after Boone's associates made their accusations. Elias listened attentively, his weathered features softening in the flickering candlelight. She inquired about his military service. He offered no glorified tales, only quiet recollections of endless nights and harsh mornings. They also shared wordless moment silences carrying more significance than any conversation. One evening, Abigail looked directly at him, her eyes clear and focused for the first time. "You could have abandoned me in that place. What made you stop?" Elias observed her thoughtfully for an extended moment. Eventually he replied, "Because nobody deserves that kind of death, and because I've already lost more than enough." She extended her hand across the table, her fingers brushing against his. For that instant, the rancher who'd withdrawn from humanity felt something reawaken within him, but beyond that room's protective walls, danger was gathering. Boone's associates circulated through drinking establishments and narrow passages, spreading veiled threats. Sheriff Hale returned bearing reports indicating missing cargo, financial discrepancies, and merchants speaking of Boone's illicit transactions. It represented merely the opening moves, yet it confirmed sufficiently that the storm approached. Elias stood near the window one evening, Observing the streetlights wavering in the darkness, Abigail's voice penetrated the quiet. "Do you think we'll ever escape this situation, Elias?" He turned, his features etched with both apprehension and optimism. "I'm uncertain," he admitted. And that question suspended itself heavily in the atmosphere. Would the sheriff's inquiry prove sufficient to topple Boone? Or would Boone launch his attack first before the reality could emerge into daylight? The sheriff's inquiry progressed more rapidly than Boone anticipated. Throughout several days, Sheriff Hale dispatched men to interrogate merchants and examine dusty record books. Fragment by fragment, the reality began taking shape. Merchants provided testimony. Documentation surfaced. Gold transports that should have arrived at neighboring settlements had evaporated mysteriously, and every trail pointed toward a single individual, Silas Boone, sheriff. Hale rode into the settlement accompanied by Elias and Abigail beside him. The townsfolk assembled, their expressions tense as Hale presented the evidence. Boone protested loudly, hurled accusations of fabrication, but the burden of documentation proved overwhelming. And for the first instance, the population gazed upon him not through fear's lens, but through furies they'd trembled before him for years. Yet with the sheriff's proof displayed openly, their terror transformed into rage. Elias observed silently as voices escalated. The identical villagers who'd previously abandoned Abigail beneath the sun now turned against the individual who'd condemned her. They hauled Boone toward the precise location where Abigail had endured her ordeal. 4 metal stakes awaited in the dust. Restraints prepared, the villagers spoke collectively. "If the sun serves as our arbiter, let it pass judgment on you, Boone." His objections dissolved, consumed by the identical code he'd imposed upon others. Boone found himself secured to the ground, staring upward at the identical pitiless sky he'd trusted to punish the vulnerable. Abigail positioned herself behind Elias. Her eyes widened, her lips trembling uncontrollably. "This is barbaric," she whispered softly. Elias placed his palm on her shoulder. "Indeed," he acknowledged. "Yet occasionally a brutal code devours the individual who created it, and perhaps that constitutes adequate justice." The crowd rotated away, abandoning Boone to confront the scorching sun in isolation. And thus the ancient code that once condemned the blameless now became the conclusion for the guilty. As the disturbance settled, Sheriff Hale addressed Elias and Abigail. "You're liberated now, both of you. However, liberty in this territory always demands payment. Don't forget that reality." They departed the settlement together. The sun was sinking, transforming the skyline into flames and amber. Abigail glanced toward Elias, her voice gentle yet firm. "Thank you. You restored more than simply my life. You restored my hope." For the first instance in numerous years, Elias permitted himself a modest smile. Hope represented something he'd believed forever lost, and now it lived again, right there beside him. So what lesson emerges from this narrative? Perhaps that fairness, though delayed, will inevitably arrive. Perhaps that a single individual's bravery can shatter chains others fear touching. And perhaps, just perhaps, affection can flourish even throughout the most unforgiving wastelands. If this tale's power resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like. And remember to subscribe so you can journey with me into the next frontier story. Now, I pose this to you. Had you been present that afternoon, would you have possessed the courage to cut those bindings? Would you have challenged the settlement and their customs? And do you believe harsh traditions should ever determine who survives and who perishes? Share your perspective in the comments. I'd truly value hearing your thoughts.